Hello everyone, my name is Luz, and the topic that I'm gonna discuss with you today is a case study from the International Economist book. The case study is called Has the Growth of Newly Industrializing Countries Hurt Advanced Nations? This case study is going to focus mainly in the relationship between the United States and Mexico. In here, the United States will play the role, of course, of the advanced nation, and Mexico the one of the newly industrialized country. As you may know, Mexico's and United States relationships it's a bit complicated and has lots of ups and downs. So in this topic, it's really interesting to analyze how their trade agreements may benefit or may affect the other country, the other part. And we will visit that in a few moments, but before of that, I'm going to give some context about the relationship between these countries and some concepts to understand future analysis. The first concept that we're going to visit is, of course, the concept of a newly industrialized country. But what is a newly industrialized country? It's a country whose level of economic development ranks somewhere between developing and highly developed classification. To sum it up, it's basically a country which is in the middle of the classification. It's not a developed country, but it's also not a low developed country. These countries have some characteristics for it to make themselves into the classification. One of the most important ones is that it's a country that has moved away from an agriculture-based economy and into a more industrialized urban economy. More fabrics, more infrastructure, more. Also, we can put in there more quality of life. Also, the GDP is really important, and we can see it here. A substantial growth in gross domestic product is important for the country to make it into this classification. Even though the growth falls short of developed nations, of course, um, because it's obvious that part. I will also would like to say that this classification it's really ambiguous because there are some countries that may have these characteristics but are not in the classification. At the end of the day, the classifications is decided between a group of people, and it may vary because of the time or or the opinions of the rest. In here, we can see some examples of newly industrialized countries. I'm gonna say some of these. This list is from the countries that have been into consideration of the nomination since the 2000s. In here we can see South Africa, for example, Mexico, Brazil, Mexico and Brazil being the only two Latin American or American countries which are considered in this classification. We consider also, well, the economists and sociologists consider China and India too, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Turkey. There are more other countries considering this classification, but I wanted just to put the ones from the 2000s. Before I continue, I'm going to just clarify that I'm not now gonna use also the abbreviation of the newly industrialized country, which is NIC, for me to explain it easier. And being said that, I'm now gonna discuss the relations between the NICs and a highly developed nation. In here we can see in the image the US President Joe Biden and Mexico's President Andrés Manuel López Obrador making treaties or agreements or something like that. We can see a lot of these countries make relationships and agreements, trades, and things like that. But why? Why these relations happen? Well, developed countries may see opportunities in the growing stability of a newly industrialized country. They prefer to make agreements with these countries because, being said here, they have more stability than the ones that are not in the way of development. Um, they see opportunities of additional outsourcing by companies to facilities within these countries. They see trade opportunities. One example that I can share with you is that in Mexico we have lots of factories that produce automobile parts. Um, when they are produced, these companies send it to the United States so that the United States can produce the full motor or the full car. So that's an example because the United States is it's using the labor force in Mexico to produce its goods, to produce part of a product. And at the end of the day, it's cheaper for them to do that because of the payments in Mexico and all that stuff. But not only because of Mexico being its neighbor, but also because it has more stability, for example, than or more they are more calm to do that maybe than doing it, for example, Venezuela or another country that has no and not great stability in terms of economy, in terms of politics, and all that stuff. So, being said this example, now I'm gonna move to my next slide to talk about the trade agreement between the United States and Mexico. As you maybe know, Mexico has an agreement with United States and Canada called NAFTA. Well, the original one was called NAFTA. Now the agreement has a more complicated name, but um, people often call it NAFTA 2.0. So I'm gonna still refer as it as NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And basically, the agreement stands by its name. It's an agreement to boost trade, eliminate barriers, and reduce tariffs on imports and exports between these three countries. Um, the agreement was made in the 1990s, and the main objective of the agreement was to build economic growth for each party. Of course, because of the geographic location of these three countries, it was a very promising agreement, and the the results are really clear. I'm going to explain them in the next slide. But one thing that I would like to say is that according to the Trump administration, prior to signing NAFTA 2.0, NAFTA, well, they referred as NAFTA that has led to trade deficits, factory closures, and job losses for the US. Why I say this? Because in this is like part of the question that our case study is wondering is really NAFTA or the terms of the trade between the United States and Mexico primarily benefiting more Mexico than the United States. The United States is losing. We'll talk about it in a few moments. And before we do that, I'm gonna show you this little chart where we can see the trade volumes in US dollars between the countries since the start of the trade agreement NAFTA till 2015. And if we see the US-Mexico part, we can see that the real increase in percentage between those years has been 255% the increase of the trade volumes. So we can clearly say that that they have boosted the trade because of this agreement. Also, we can see positive increase between the US and Canada and Mexico and Canada. So it has been a really beneficial in terms of trade for the countries is if we see it like that. But now I'm gonna ask the main question of the case study and we're going to enter the analysis deeper. Has the US experienced deterioration in its terms of trade as Mexico experienced significant growth? In here we can, this is the main question of the case study. And if we go back to the title, it has the growth of newly industrializing countries for the advanced nations. In this case, well, has the United States been hurt by Mexico's growth? Is this the case of the NAFTA? We'll see. And first, I'm going to show you a graph. In this graph, we can see the GDP per capita between 1997 and the 2020. Being the lowest line being Mexico and the highest one being the US. What tendency can we see in this graph? Well, Mexico's line is maintained practically the same, which means its GDP has maintained more or less the same levels. And we can see in the United States part that it shows growth. So the United States GDP has growth between these years, which are the years that NAFTA has been active. And we can examine whether the growth of the Mexican economy in the past decades has generated aggregate losses for the US economy. Well, seeing this graph, we cannot see that the Mexico's growth has overpassed the United States, but what we can examine it's in the we'll talk about it in the next slide. If we want to examine if the United States has experienced economic losses between of the terms of trade with Mexico, we can say that the percentage real income effect of a change in terms of trade is approximately equal to the percent change in terms of trade multiplied by the share of imports income. This may seem a little complicated, and if you go to the book, it's demonstrated mathematically at the end. I didn't want to put it here because it may get a little confusing, but highlighted below that, it's the summary. This weird sentence and the demonstrations practically says that the terms of trade of the US will have to decline by several percent a year to be a noticeable drag on economic growth. If we compare the graphic that we saw in the prior slide, we can see that the GDP of the United States has been growing while the Mexican one has maintained the same. So in terms of GDP, now the US is winning. But if we see the terms of trade of NAFTA between the two countries, we'll get another point of view. Let's see the graph. In here, we see the evolution of the terms of trade for the United States and Mexico since 1980 till 2016, something like that. The NAFTA began on the 1990s, so it's around here. Mexico being the red line, and the US the blue line. And what we can see is that Mexico has only surpassed a little the United States between the 2008 around that year. So if we bring back the statement that we said before, that that the terms of trade will have to decline by several percent a year to be a noticeable drag on economic growth, we cannot see that the United States has been declining its terms of trade throughout the years. So analyzing this graph, we can say that there's no evidence or that Mexico is experience significant growth in terms of trade, while the US is deteriorating. And that's why we can say that the statement is not true in this particular case study. Well, being said that, analyzing those graphs, I have three conclusions. There is no evidence that the US has suffered any kind of sustained loss from a long-term deterioration in its terms of trade. And also, there is no evidence that Mexico's terms of trade has steadily appreciated or growth or surpassed as US-Mexico integration deepened due to NAFTA. The US has not been hurt by the growth of Mexico. Basically, that's the main conclusion that we can get in this case study. It's a very particular case to analyze because some of the, we can say in the other part that some of the developing in, well, the NIC countries may get variations in its GDP. They may go lower than before or higher because these countries, the main exports that they give to other countries are agricultural goods or yes, or oils and all that stuff, and the price of the market may vary in the terms of trade or the prices. So the fluctuation of if its GDP may worsen the GDP of those countries. So with this being said, we can also like conclude that if someone is going to deteriorate or it's going to lose in terms of trade, it's always going to be the, well, not always, but it may be the majority of times the NIC. Well, that's everything that I have to say today. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to also leave you my references that I used for this presentation, which again, as I said at the beginning, this case study you can find it in the International Economic book. The case study, well, you know the title, and also I use some references that I found on internet about the concepts or the background of for understanding this case study. And if you have any questions, I'm available in my mail, so we can discuss further things if you would like to. And thank you again for your attention, and hope you find this well, and see you.